Good day and welcome to another video here on The Pulse. Today we're going to be doing what is a bit of a critique on somewhat of this narrative around excess deaths, and the part of this that we're going to be critiquing is the discussion that the vaccine cannot be linked to excess deaths. Now, we wanted to do this because at the end of the day, this is obviously a very large conversation when we're talking about excess deaths during the time of the pandemic. On one hand, we hear that it was COVID-19, and on the other hand, we hear that no, it must have been the vaccines. And perhaps even on the other hand, we're hearing that it's a combination of all things put together. Now, the importance here is that if decisions that were made during the course of the pandemic to, instill public health policy did have a deleterious effect on overall all-cause mortality, and that we're seeing excess deaths, it becomes important to look into this and look into it in a credible way, because if we don't, then we're basically not learning from our decisions or potentially our mistakes in the past. Now, of course, what we're going to be looking at here is a bit of a critique on a woman who made a video online, and her perspective very much resembles sort of the mainstream perspective on this, which is that the vaccines cannot be linked to any excess deaths around the world. This is not a personal attack on her in any way, shape, or form. That's not really what we're trying to do here at all. It's literally just a conversation that brings a lot more complexity and nuance to this discussion. Final thing I want to say before we get into this is that, anytime we're looking at a very complex narrative like COVID-19, right? Like, we're human beings. We are beings. We are embodied beings. We're not computers. We're not just, hey, let's look at the data, let's look at the facts, and then we make decisions based on that. There's more to life than that. And there's philosophy, there's how we feel about things, there's the experiences we want to have. So we have to be able to understand the facts when they matter, and we have to know how to put those in context into how we make meaning as beings. So I just wanted to leave that on the table as just a thought to think about, more so at the end of this. Realistically, at the end of the day here, we're going to be going through what is much more of just assessing the facts, trying to understand what is happening with the discussion of excess deaths. Madhava, it's good to have you back on the show. Let's dive into some of what you have broken down here with regards to this discussion around excess deaths.
Yes, it's a very important discussion, and I'm bringing this to your audience for a number of reasons. I'm going to be dissecting the arguments given by a Dr. Oliver, whose YouTube channel is called Back to the Science. And in this clip, she is talking about the excess deaths that are being, in her mind, unfairly attributed to vaccines. And I thought this was a very important piece of content to dissect for a couple of reasons. The first being is that she is using the data from the Office of National Statistics from England, which is a very important data set because England has been much more transparent with their data compared to the United States, number one. And number two, this is a very, very big topic. Like, why are people dying at a higher rate? And is the vaccine responsible? And the reason why I thought this would be an interesting clip to dissect is that, she doesn't have a very large audience, so she's not necessarily moving the discussion towards her understanding. I believe she has maybe 5,000 or 6,000 views on this video the last time I watched, but it is her arguments that I think are representative of the vaccine proponents' fear. And I think it's important for us to examine exactly what they're saying and realize how we can assess what they're saying and challenge it. So that's why I'd like to talk about this particular piece. Dr. Oliver, you seem like a nice person. I have nothing against you. I'm just going to look at what you're saying in this clip. So again, it's the ONS data, and Dr. Oliver is claiming that misinformation is being spread about the interpretation of the data. So let's take a look at her position. So what I'd like to do is play the most important clips or segments from her presentation so that we have an understanding of what she's saying and how and why she's saying it.
And welcome to Back to the Science. I'm Dr. Susan Oliver, and I'm a scientist, and back there is Cindy Oliver, and she's a dog. Over the last month or so, there has been an increase in people falsely claiming that vaccines are resulting in excess deaths. Some people are saying it directly, and some people are saying it indirectly. And I'll just show you an example of one of the people who was saying it directly, because it gives you an idea of the type of intellect involved. This is a tweet from someone known as kevinbliar.com, and that certainly is a very apt name for him. According to Kevin, the 1918 Spanish flu did not kill 50 million people. Vaccines that the government forced them to take did, and they are repeating the same pattern now. 50 million people dead from 1918 flu vaccine. Now, as I'm sure most of you know, there was no flu vaccine in 1918.
So what do you think, Joe? How would you
Yeah,
assess
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's a sense of certainty in the way she's saying, "Hey, look, these people are outright falsely claiming this," which, I mean, the whole point is they're offering questions. And then to sort of, tear down the entirety of the argument, she uses a meme that obviously was not very well researched and put together, and that becomes the point in which she attacks, as opposed to probably a lot more of the credible, offers that are out there.
Correct. Yeah, I'm with you 100%. And notice that she brought up intellect. In other words, she's implying that people who take the opposite position to hers are not very smart. That's another important point. Let's go on and see what she says next.
So that's the direct approach, but some people are also using a more indirect approach in an attempt to get around YouTube guidelines. An example of this is Dr. John Campbell. He has recorded a number of videos where he presents various anecdotes and data on excess deaths, and then reminds his followers that he is not allowed to present any information on vaccines contrary to the information provided by local health authorities and the World Health Organization. Based on the comments on his videos, his followers are getting the message loud and clear that John thinks that vaccines are at least partially responsible for the excess deaths that are being seen. But by not saying it outright, he gets around the YouTube guidelines and keeps his revenue stream.
Thoughts, Joe?
Yeah, again, she's pointing to a conversation that needs to be had as well. Instead of John Campbell's offering nuance and, hey guys, let's explore this open-mindedly. No, instead he's just holding back to get around YouTube guidelines. That's his agenda. His agenda is to get around the YouTube guidelines. And then also she brings up, there's no way, he says that they could be partially responsible, as if like that's a crazy hypothesis to have, when it's a very reasonable hypothesis to have, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I would also have to mention that, I would say her main thrust in terms of assessing John Campbell's intention is to keep his income stream, which is, it's possible. But, she's bringing up a very important part of this, which is we're censored on YouTube. You can't say everything you want to say. And that is a huge problem, actually, when it comes down to science. And, we have a doctor, John Campbell, who I believe is doing his very best. But again, this is very subjective and opinion. So let's just talk about like what her argument is and see if we can figure out where she's coming from. Here we are. And she's going to talk about how easy it is to prove these people wrong.
It's amazingly easy to determine if vaccines are leading to an increase in excess deaths. All we need to do is compare the death rate amongst vaccinated people with the death rate amongst unvaccinated people. And it just so happens the information to do that is available for England on this ONS webpage. The information is available in an Excel spreadsheet, but I've pulled out the main numbers and put them into a PowerPoint slide to make them easier to see. This table shows the age-standardised mortality rates for deaths by vaccination status in England. And the data includes all deaths occurring between the 1st of January 2021 and the 31st of May 2022. And that's the most up-to-date information at the moment. And when they say vaccinated, that is any number of vaccines at any time. So it includes people who have only just had their first dose, as well as people who have had 3 doses. So when we look at deaths from all causes, we see the age standardised mortality rate for vaccinated people is 957.4 per 100,000 person years, compared with 2,307.5 for the unvaccinated. So obviously the unvaccinated are much more likely to die than the vaccinated. However, this does include COVID deaths, so maybe it isn't a fair comparison because we know that the COVID vaccines are going to reduce COVID deaths. So let's have a look at non-COVID deaths. Here we see that the age standardised mortality rate is 892.9 per 100,000 person years for the vaccinated, compared to 1,474.3 for the unvaccinated. So even when we are just looking at non-COVID deaths, the unvaccinated are still more likely to die, which is, of course, the exact opposite of what you would see if the vaccines were in fact leading to excess deaths. And I will be discussing later in the video why we see more deaths amongst the unvaccinated, even for deaths that don't involve COVID. And for completeness, these are the mortality rates for deaths involving COVID.
Okay. So the things I want to point out here is she believes that this question is amazingly easy to answer, which I don't particularly agree with, and I'm going to obviously offer my reasoning next. I want to make sure we all see the big numbers that she's pointing out here. It is the all-cause mortality rate in vaccinated versus unvaccinated. It's 957.4 versus 2337.5, which is a factor of about 2.4. So that's something to keep in mind as we move through this, because I'm going to be hitting on that over and over again. The next line is, sorry about that, was her point about the non-COVID deaths are higher. The mortality rate is higher in the unvaccinated. It has nothing to do with COVID-19. Why are non-COVID-19 deaths higher if you've been unvaccinated? Or why are they lower if you've been vaccinated? So that's a very, very interesting question. And then she will explain it here by offering us this study in Nature Medicine that was published in February of 2022. And what this published piece of medical information is stating is that there are risks that put you at higher risk for death after being infected from COVID-19, meaning you don't necessarily have to die from COVID-19. You are now at a higher risk of dying from other things. And what are those things? It's here on the right: cerebrovascular disorders, dysrhythmias, inflammatory heart disease, ischemic heart disease, other cardiac disorders, basically, and thrombotic disorders, which is like pulmonary emboli, where clots move from your body into your lung and kill you that way. And you can see at the far right, you have these purple bars, which demonstrate the burden of these diseases in people who have had COVID before. So her argument here is that the vaccine or COVID itself may not kill you, but the long-term COVID effects will. And so that's how you can have increased mortality in people who are unvaccinated that have nothing to do with COVID. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the interesting question here will be ultimately, like, in this study, stripping out the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated and seeing how, whether that study was done in terms of long COVID or the effects of the spike protein in essence.
Precisely. And then to, put the nail in the coffin, she tells us about the elephant in the room.
Elephant in the room. And this is the effect the pandemic has had on what was already a stretched NHS.
Okay, so finally she's saying, look, let's be real here. The pandemic lockdowns have really hurt people. So now what I'd like to do is to go backwards from what she says last and go all the way back to the ONS data and dissect her arguments and dissect the data. So the elephant in the room, the effect of the pandemic lockdowns, what is the problem with using that to explain the reason why vaccines are not contributing to excess deaths? Well, the lockdowns affected both the vaccinated and the unvaccinated people, right? So it is a reason why excess mortality is higher, but you cannot exonerate the vaccine simply by looking at the excess mortality and attributing that to lockdowns, because lockdowns affected both. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're saying if an unvaccinated person missed a medical screening, a vaccinated person would have missed a medical screening as well.
Precisely. So it's affecting both populations. Now, let us go back to her article in Nature Medicine that had to do with cardiovascular complications from COVID-19. So the most important thing is, as you mentioned before, were the people in this study vaccinated? And as a matter of fact, as I indicated here with the underlying portions, in total, 61.93% of the people who got COVID got the vaccine, and about the same, 56.29% in the people who didn't get COVID got the vaccine. So this study is looking at a group of people where most people have been vaccinated during the period of observation. So it cannot be used to necessarily say that the vaccine was not contributing to these things. Moreover, did the study look at mortality? Because that's what we're trying to answer. And the answer is no. It did not look at mortality. It looked simply at those things here on the right. These are serious conditions that follow COVID-19, but what is the mortality of those things? We don't know. That's not what the study was designed to answer at all. It just said these particular conditions are higher in people who have had COVID. So jumping from mortality to these kinds of conditions is a leap that can't be justified. Now, I'm going to show you this. This authors of the study acknowledge the fact that vaccines are associated with myopericarditis. And so looking at that one outcome, which is myopericarditis, they decided to examine what the risk was of getting these two conditions if you're vaccinated or if we just ignore vaccination. So this is the important part of this slide. And of course, this is buried in the supplementary material of the study that she offered. And in this particular table, we're looking at the burden of myocarditis and pericarditis in people where we included COVID-19 vaccinations, okay? And what we see is that the burden is 0.5 per 100,000 persons. So in 1,000 person years, the risk, there would be 0.5 cases, basically. Now, we're looking at situations where we're comparing vaccinated people, like we did not exclude vaccination. When we exclude vaccination, here we're seeing that it's as soon as someone, if you have a positive COVID-19 test, I mean, you have COVID, they only looked at you until you got vaccinated or the period of observation ended. The COVID-19 burden is less. What does that mean? that means if you eliminate vaccination in this group of people, if you eliminate COVID-19 vaccination, the risk is less. If you include COVID-19 vaccination, the risk is higher. Now, we're looking at 0.37 per 1,000 person years versus 0.5. So it's not a high absolute risk, but the relative risk is, about 30% higher. So if anything, in this study is showing that vaccination is increasing your risk of getting myopericarditis, one of the things that the authors were looking at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially saying that the vaccine is responsible for injuries, and if she's making the argument that these injuries are potentially the cause of the excess death in the unvaccinated, she can't make that argument because the study itself is saying that the vaccination actually also increases that risk.
Yes, at least for these two small outcomes.
Yeah.
With regards to all of the other outcomes, they did not separate the vaccinated population from the unvaccinated population.
Yeah.
So we have no idea.
This is
Now,
just
go
to be
ahead.
clear, I mean, this is acknowledging that the vaccine is doing some harm, which is, I think, what she's trying to get away from.
She's trying to get away from it. She's just she's just saying that people with long haul COVID can die of things other than COVID.
Yeah.
So that's why she's presenting the study. Now, she's making another assumption by presenting this. And the assumption is that if you are vaccinated, you have a less chance of getting COVID-19. Okay? Is that true? Well, if we go to the ONS, that's not what the ONS data says at all. What we're looking at here is the last time the ONS reported a comparative measure of the risk of getting COVID between the vaccinated and unvaccinated. And I've highlighted that there in the red for you. And this is as of March 27th, 2022, the last time they looked at it. And what we see here is that in every age group, except if you're under 18, the risk of getting COVID-19 if you're vaccinated is higher than if you're unvaccinated. And by vaccinated, I'm talking about being fully vaccinated and boosted. So if we were to look through this, for example, in the 18 to 29-year-old cohort, it's 3,118 versus 941.6. These are cases per 100,000 people. So it's over 3 times higher if you're vaccinated and boosted. 30 to 39 is about 4 times higher. And this trend continues for every single age group. So the point here is that the risk of getting COVID is higher if you're vaccinated. We're not talking about deaths. We're just talking about the risk of getting COVID. So when you jump to, long COVID is killing people for reasons other than COVID-19, you're not paying attention to the fact that the risk of getting COVID is higher if you're vaccinated from the same data set. Is that clear?
Yeah. So if you're concerned about long haul symptoms, so on and so forth, that come from repeated COVID infection, then why would you want to continue to get vaccinated if, as the data suggests at the moment, you're getting COVID more often?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And she's saying that long COVID is the reason why unvaccinated people are dying for non-COVID-19 reasons, but the risk of getting COVID is higher if you're vaccinated. Let's move on. So now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty and the technical details of the ONS data. And she basically makes her point by saying that things are amazingly easy because all you have to do is look at the whole period, all-cause, age-standardized mortality rate in the unvaccinated versus ever vaccinated. And again, here's the ratio. It's about 2.4 to 1, the unvaccinated in the blue. Now, what is the problem with this? Well, I'm going to break it down in 2 ways. One is the problem that we arrive at when we're looking at whole period numbers. And the other is when we look at age standardization. So let's look at what I mean by whole period. So, she's looking over, well, she's not looking, she's quoting the number for across the entire pandemic period while the vaccination was available. So we're looking at 17 months of data. What she's not looking at are the mortality trends. This was also given in the data set that she was analyzing. So let us look at the mortality trends over time. When we look at COVID-19 mortality in people who have gotten one shot, what do we see? Well, in the beginning, if you were unvaccinated, your mortality rates were much higher, as you can see. But over time, from about April 2021 through the rest of the observational period, what do we see? They're about the same, right? Is this a surprise? No, it's not a surprise because, these are only people who have gotten one shot. So we don't expect there to be a difference between COVID-19 mortality in the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Good. So nothing surprising there. But now let us look at the all-cause mortality in people who have received one shot. Uh-oh, there's a problem, right? Once again, the all-cause mortality is in the blue, and the people who have gotten one shot within 21 days is in the red, and people who have gotten one shot greater than 21 days is in the green. Now, this is unequivocally a demonstration that people who have gotten vaccinated in this specific group, one shot only, have a higher mortality from all causes for most of the pandemic period. Is that clear?
Yeah, just as a friendly clarifier, what does the y-axis mean there? And also, all of this is gleaned from the ONS data, correct?
That is correct. It's coming from the ONS data set that she analyzed for us. And the y-axis, or the vertical axis, is the is the mortality rate, meaning these are the number of deaths per 100,000 person years at each given month. And so in February, where the unvaccinated all-cause mortality peaked, it's about 5,250 per 100,000. Similarly, in June of 2021, where the one jabbed greater than 21 days peaked, was higher, was about, it looks like about 6,500 per 100,000. More importantly, for most of the pandemic period, the one jabbed people had a greater mortality rate. This is from the ONS data. Let's look at what happens if when we compare COVID-19 mortality if you've been jabbed twice. And once again, we see in the beginning of the pandemic, there was a huge benefit in terms of preventing COVID-19 deaths if you had gotten two jabs. But later on in the pandemic, starting from around December 2021, we see that COVID mortality is actually a little bit higher in people who've been jabbed more than 6 months out. And we can also say that the benefit in terms of preventing COVID-19 mortality, in other words, is not so great, not nearly as good as it was in the beginning. Why is that? What's happening? Well, it's pretty clear that the virus has changed, right? The vaccine is no longer matched to the strains that are pervading the population right now. In the beginning, we had the ancestral strain. We had a vaccine that was targeted the ancestral strain. And by December of 2021, we have Omicron, which is entirely, I want to say entirely, it's a much different virus. And so we would expect that in terms of preventing COVID-19 mortality, the vaccine would be much less effective after a year. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So we're only looking at COVID-19 mortality. Now let's look with two shots, what happens with all-cause mortality? Uh-oh. We have another issue. All-cause mortality is definitely reduced in the beginning of the pandemic. And the questionnaire, once again, is from November 2021. We see that if you've been jabbed twice, independent of how long you've been jabbed in terms of time elapsed from the second jab, your all-cause mortality is higher than if you're unvaccinated. This is a really, really important, question to put in our minds. Is we see that the vaccine is not so effective at preventing COVID-19 after time, mainly because of the emerging variants. But why is mortality higher? It's one thing to say that it's equal, but why is it higher? there's no question that this points to some sort of harm to some people if you've been doubly jabbed.
Yeah, just to be clear here, because there's a little bit of complexity, and like I guess the the different lines represent uh, essentially people moving in and out of these categories, right? And likewise with the single jab. So like, it's not like we were always looking at, the single jab people or the double, because, sometimes those single jab were getting double jabbed, or sometimes it was before 6 months, then they became after 6 months. So they're moving. How does that, sort of complexity play into this?
Well, the point here is we have to be careful when we're looking at this, because we're looking at the all-cause mortality in groups that have been exposed to the vaccine for the same amount of time. So it's not like we're saying that mortality goes up the further you've been out. When we look at, say, the purple graph, what we're saying is that at a different time in the pandemic, the all-cause mortality for people who've been jabbed twice goes up. We don't have an explanation. We're just saying that there's a correlation. And as you said, people move from subgroup to subgroup. So many of the people who got the first jab got the second jab, and they moved into these groups now. And then, as we're going to see next, the people who were jabbed twice, when it became appropriate for them to get a booster, many of them did. Let's say we're back in March of 2021, right here. Should you get the jab? Yes, right. I mean, look at the all-cause mortality is way higher in the unvaxxed. I'm not saying you should get it. I'm not giving you medical advice. I'm saying the numbers point to the fact that it's safer in terms of preventing death to get jabbed. But answering that question in, say, January of 2022, you get to the opposite conclusion, right? Because the all-cause mortality in January of 2022 is higher if you've been doubly jabbed. Now let us look at what happens when you get jabbed, when you get boosted. Again, we're looking at COVID-19 mortality, and I'm taking it from September, October of 2021, where boosted mortality rates could be calculated when the booster became available. We see that in protecting people against COVID-19, there is a clear benefit when the booster came out. By the end of the period, May 2022, that benefit is rather unclear. The efficacy or effectiveness of the booster is waning, just like we saw with the first jab and the second jab. But once again, let us compare that to what happens between all-cause mortality. We have a very unclear picture. We can see that the lines are crisscrossing, and by January of 2022, if you've been recently boosted, your mortality rate from all causes is now higher than if you're unvaccinated. And by the end of the study period, May 2022, again, 4 months ago, they're converging, even if you've been boosted greater than 3 weeks out. Make sense?
Yep.
So what can explain these kinds of things? And one thing to note here is we're looking at very, very large groups of people in all groups. And for comparison, I've shown you the number of person years in each group as time goes on. So in the top graph, we see in January of 2021, we're looking at 3 million person years in the month of January. What does that mean? What's a person year? A person year is one person living for a year. So if there's 3 million person years in 1 month, we're looking at a group of people that number about 36 million. So these are very large numbers. Now, in the red and purple, we're looking at people who've been jabbed twice. They're smaller, but not much smaller. They're much smaller, but they're still a very large number. Because if we look, say, here by April, May, we're looking at about 500,000 person years, which is about 6 million people. And the green is the less than 6 months doubly jabbed. Really, really high numbers. We're looking at 12, 14 million people here. And And when we are looking at the mortality rates, you can't say, well, it's just a very small group of people. No, we're looking at huge groups of people, especially compared to the trials. If you remember, the big issue that came out of the trials was that after 6 months, all-cause mortality was higher if you've been vaccinated. And you might be able to attribute that to a very small group of people because each group was 20,000 over 6 months, which amounts to 10,000 person years. And here we're looking at millions of person years in every group. And so when there is a mortality signal, it is a real signal, at least compared to the vaccine trials. And finally, I'm just going to conclude this part of it looking at boosted, which is the lower, and we see that the boosted population from the beginning of 2022 far exceeds that of the unvaccinated. So we're looking at very large numbers here. This is the issue we have with looking at whole period. You sum it up over the whole period, you come up with the numbers that she's quoting. But if you look at it month to month, things are changing depending upon your vaccine status. And it doesn't always paint a rosy picture for the vaccine. Now I'm going to look at briefly the problem with standardizing by age. And we talk about age standardization a lot. Like that's really important. We must always standardize by age. What I want to show you here is the following. Let's go to this slide. The left graph or the left pie chart is the standardized population distribution in Europe in 2013. And what we're seeing here on the left is the proportional contribution of each age group. So the largest contribution is people who are 18 to 39. Not only are there a lot of young people in general, but we're looking at a very large group of people that spans, in this case, 21 years versus the other groups that are divided by 10-year age groups. Why do I do that? Well, that's the way that the data is grouped together in the ONS. So on the left is, how we look at a population to standardize it. Now, here's the issue. If you look at the unvaccinated people in the ONS data, the young people who are unvaccinated make up 51% of the entire group of unvaccinated people. But the vaccinated group on the right, they only make up 25%. And as you can see, as you move to larger and larger age groups or older and older age groups, the contribution of those people in the unvaccinated population diminishes very quickly. Why is that? It's because young people don't want to get vaccinated or choose not to get vaccinated. Older people are much more apt to choose the jab. So this is the problem that we run into when we're looking at two groups of people who don't take the vaccine at the same rate. What I've done is I wanted to make sure that that the ONS and my understanding of what's happening is actually consistent with what the ONS data has shown. Now, on the left here is what Dr. Oliver presented, which is true. She pulled it, right out of the summary. And what I did was I went back and looked at every single age group over the months that were given and calculated using their formula that the ONS gives for age standardization just to make sure that I was doing things correctly. And what you see here is that the numbers are slightly higher than the summary that was given by the ONS. And the reason for that, to my understanding, the best I could hypothesize is that the graph on the left includes people who are over the age of 10, but the data that was given month to month by the ONS was only for people greater than 18. And we know that young people are much less likely to die. So in both situations, both the blue and the red, the numbers are slightly higher when looking at a population from 18 up. But the most important thing here is that the ratio between the unvaccinated and the vaccinated is about 2.4, almost exactly. So I think my point here is that the age standardization computation that I used is in fact accurate in what the ONS is reporting. Now, going back to this, we see that we have completely different population distributions in the unvaccinated and vaccinated. Now, here's the problem, is what do you do when you have a much younger group of people that are not getting vaccinated and a much older group of people that are getting vaccinated? And the solution is to standardize. That's why we always look for age standardization. But if we don't standardize and we just look at the number of deaths per people alive in the unvaccinated and vaccinated group, we get this: a much higher rate of mortality in the people who have been vaccinated. And on the left, I'm showing you, if we look at the whole period, it looks like there's about a 50% higher mortality rate if you look at 17 months of data. And if you look only at Omicron, the mortality rate, if you've been vaccinated, is more than twice as high. Why is this? What's going on here? And how do we make sense of this? You know, how do we reconcile two very different risks of all-cause mortality? And I want to be very clear here. I don't want people to start, going to, oh my God, the vaccine is killing everybody, because look at the mortality rates. The issue is that younger people are not getting vaccinated, and their mortality rate is much, much lower than people who are older. So when we look at a group of people that are much younger in the unvaccinated, we would expect that the mortality rate as a group would be much lower because they make a larger contribution. That's what's happening when we look only at number of deaths and person years into two groups. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So to summarize, using deaths per person years will give an increased mortality rate in the vaccinated because older people are getting vaccinated. But the reason the risk is higher in the vaccinated is because they're older. It's lower in the vaccinated because younger people are vaccinating at a lower rate. So that's why they want to age standardize. But here's the thing, is that the ONS is giving us the mortality rates, deaths per person years in every single age category. So to make a personal decision, you should consider what is the mortality rate in your age group. That's the proper way to proceed when it comes down to giving medical advice or making a decision about your own risk. So let us do that. On the left, again, is what she's quoted here, 2.4 times a risk if you've been unvaxxed. And again, this is whole period age standardized. That's how they got this number. But if we look at the whole period, what do we see here? We see that if you're old, greater than 80, the mortality risk is significantly higher if you're unvaxxed from all causes. But as you grow younger, or if you look at younger and younger age groups, the 18 to 39 group and the 40 to 49 group, which comprises a huge swath of our population. Sadly, I'm not in either of those groups. But the mortality risk ratio is only a little bit higher if you're unvaccinated. That's what it shows. And then if we look only at the Omicron period or the most recent period, we see that those risks of not getting vaccinated are even smaller. The risk of dying of all causes in every age group is higher if you're unvaccinated. That's what the ONS data shows. But it is misleading just to put up this figure here and say, look, it's clear, it's amazingly simple. Everybody would be protected if they get vaccinated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's at the end of the day, according to this graph, people aged 49 and under, essentially, there's very little benefit to the vaccine versus not. And therefore, the idea of a personal choice, because you're accepting risk by taking the therapeutic, becomes important, a lot more important per se, than in the other. I mean, everybody should have a choice in my view. This is my personal opinion. But
Sure.
if you're just assessing your risk, those age groups glean very, very little benefit from the vaccine.
That's precisely correct. Very little benefit. It's up to you. You should not be mandated. But before we go on, I want to make these important points, which is your risk depends on your age, as we just said here. Showing someone this graph over here and saying that it applies to everybody is, in my mind, irresponsible. Moreover, we have already gone through the fact that there are people that are dying at a higher rate if they've been vaccinated. Those were the graphs where we looked at 1 jab, 2 jabbed, and now we're getting to boosted, and we don't have any recent data. But clearly, in some people, there is a detriment to being vaccinated. So you cannot exonerate the vaccine from contributing to excess mortality. And we're looking at large numbers of people. Now, this is based on the ONS data alone. Right away, we can say that to say that the vaccine is not contributing to excess mortality is a mistake. But recall that Dr. Oliver brought up other various data sources that Dr. Campbell has brought up. What are some of the other data sources that we should be examining besides England? Let's look at Germany. This is a very interesting study that came out about a month ago that looked at German data. And again, now we're going to excess mortality and not just comparing vaccinated to unvaccinated people. We're just looking at a large population and looking at excess mortality in 2 different years, 2020 versus 2021. Now, excess mortality means how many more deaths are occurring than we would expect given historical trends in terms of percentages. There are a lot of very interesting things to pull out of this chart. The first thing I want to say is on the left, we're looking at 2020, okay? The gray right here is in total how many more people by percentages died in 2020 compared to historical trends. And the answer is it's a very tiny amount, very small. It's less than 1%, okay? Does this make sense? It shouldn't, right? Because in 2020, we had a raging pandemic that was killing everybody. Secondly, look at all these big numbers that go negative. Why is there still an excess mortality? The reason for that is that people in these age groups die at a much, much lower clip. So even though that there is a substantial percentage decrease in their mortality rate, they don't really contribute a lot to the number of deaths in the population. So on the other hand, people 70 to 79 and older, they die at a much greater rate in a given year. So when their mortality increases by 1 or 2%, it contributes way more deaths. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So what has happened now when we go to 2021? Is there a pandemic? Yes. Both years have a pandemic. In which year were lockdowns more severe? I would say it's 2020. 2021, we went back to business, with certain restrictions. Why, then, is excess mortality higher in younger age groups and still about the same in older age groups? What's going on? What is the difference between 2020 and 2021? Can you think of one? I certainly can. There was no vaccine in 2020, and there's one in 2021. Does that mean the vaccine is contributing to excess mortality? You don't know that for sure, but to simply say that it can't be the vaccine flies in the face of what we're seeing right here. This is from Germany. Now, let's look at what happened in the United States. Now, on the left is Germany, and what we're doing here is we're comparing the change in mortality rate in every age group between 2020 and 2021. In Germany, we see in every age group, the mortality is higher in 2021. But moreover, it's concentrated in younger age groups. What's going on here? The same trend is happening in the United States, and the bars are smaller. That has to do with the scale. But look, in the 35 to 44 year old age group, we have an increase in mortality between 2020 and 21. That's 18%, and this is reflective of younger age groups. What is killing our younger age groups that is present in 2021 that was not present in 2020?
Well, what
Well,
if we,
I don't
what
want
if,
to be, go ahead. Mhm.
I was just going to say, because I know we're going to get to the vaccine, but let's play it through.
Yeah,
Someone might make the argument, well, we ended lockdowns and the Delta strain was prominent, and the Delta strain may have been hitting younger people harder. What would you say to that argument?
you can't dismiss it. Yes, the COVID-19 contribution um, could be higher in Delta versus the ancestral strain.
Okay.
Possibility, yes. The other possibility, of course, is that there is some contribution to the vaccine. We don't know what it is. And the point here is not to drive home the idea that, oh my God, absolutely the vaccine is killing everybody. The point here is to not dismiss someone who says it could be the vaccine. That is a very irresponsible position to make. We have an enormous amount of data. It's very complicated. That points to the fact that vaccines could be contributing to excess mortality. There's no way to dismiss it by simply throwing up a comparison, a whole period age standardized comparison in one country and saying, oh, well, just because the mortality rate is higher in the unvaccinated, that explains everything, including the protection and no detriment to vaccination.
Yeah, I think it's also important here to acknowledge the fact that over the course of time, the lockdowns and the cause on mental health and all these different aspects, missed screenings, are also going to contribute to an increase in all cause mortality, right? So it's like,
Absolutely.
yeah, so you have to look at. I think your argument, from what I'm hearing, is you have to look at all these causes. You can't just point blank say, well, it was just COVID and people being unvaccinated.
Right. You cannot. And we also have to say that the excess mortality, at least in Germany in 2020, was no different than it was in the past. Um, so, in my mind, that's saying that the effect of the uh, pandemic was not as great as we thought it was.
Hmm.
Um, and before we conclude, I want to go back to a slide which I think is very important here, um, which is this. Here we're looking at Germany, okay? In 2020, let's just go back to 2020 for a second. Should be shocking to people.
Yeah.
And what I'm looking at here is the excess mortality in people who were over 70, let's say. It's less than 2%, and in 80 to 89-year-olds, there's no difference, barely a difference in 90-year-olds. These are the people that were supposed to be the most susceptible to COVID-19 deaths, right? Why is their excess mortality essentially unchanged? Well, there's two reasons, two hypotheses. I'm not saying that I know the answer. The first is that the SARS-CoV-2 infection, COVID-19, were killing these people before they were going to die of old age. So, of something else. So they were going to die anyway, right? The other possibility is that deaths are being misclassified in that, the cardiovascular deaths, the heart attack deaths are down not because they're simply down. It's because they died of a heart attack with COVID-19, and that's being now counted as a COVID-19 death. So that is a very important point to make clear here. This is more evidence that we run into problems with the way we're classifying deaths. So to me, this is stunning to look at these age groups in 2020 and see that there's no increase in excess mortality, which is completely different to the messaging we hear on mainstream media, in that, if you're old and sick, you're going to die from COVID and it's going to be terrible and it's killing everybody. They died at the same rate in Germany. And that's something to keep in mind. So just to conclude here, we talked about a lot of complicated things here. I could say unequivocally from my interpretation of the data and analyzing it, just from the ONS data, that the COVID vaccine is benefiting some people and it's harming others. And this is not so hard to imagine. And to engage one's sense making and logic, we get the same dose of the vaccine. It's 50 micrograms of mRNA in the Pfizer vaccine and 100 mics in the Moderna vaccine. It doesn't matter if you weigh 80 pounds or you weigh 280 pounds. Whether you're 19 or you're 99, you get the same dose. So we cannot expect that the benefit and harm would be similar in everyone. There's going to be some people where it benefits them and others where it harms them. It would be silly to think that that's not happening. And as we've shown before with those graphs, there are people who have a higher mortality after being jabbed. Or if you get jabbed, you have a higher mortality for some period of time. So you cannot say that any more clearly, that there must be some benefit and some harm. Excess mortality is a combination of COVID and the lockdowns and the vaccines. How to pull that apart is not so easy to figure out, what is the contribution of each. But to say that the vaccines are not contributing is definitely misleading. And, finally, you can't estimate the contribution of each just using the ONS data.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, yeah, absolutely. And, there's a lot of stuff to think about here. And obviously there's some technicality in some of this, but, for the most part, I can't help but always come back to this as just the way my lens works. But, we see so commonly this pull to, well, it can't be the vaccine, or, well, it has to be the vaccine. And this is this sort of, very black and white, no nuance thinking that usually ends in, again, not to pick on her, but in the video with Dr. Oliver there, she's picking on people. She's poking at their intelligence. She's poking at their hidden agendas, all these different things. And, on the flip side, you often hear people, oh, yeah, all these people are just, zombies and sheep, and they can't think anymore because they're vaccinated. You hear the insults and pejoratives on both sides. And, whereas I think right now we're being deeply, deeply called to slow down, get back into your body, feel, use both sides of your brain, think, but also understand nuance, think in a little bit more complexity, look at situations a little bit more deeply, because things aren't as black and white. And unfortunately, that's the cultural phenomenon that's coming harder and harder and harder at us, is just this extreme division of positions. And I think, you've done a really good job of pointing out how that won't get us anywhere in figuring out what's going on.
Correct as usual. The Dr. Oliver, I think, is, as I said earlier on, is representative of a group of people online that are simplifying a very complicated situation. And as you said, we have to make our own personal choices. But ultimately, this is going to come down to, what do our public health authorities say? Yep. And it is irresponsible of them, as ones that are telling us what to do, to, it's one thing for Dr. Oliver to say one thing, or someone online, but it's a different thing when we say, like, everyone everywhere should get vaccinated. That is incredibly irresponsible. And it was done, more than a year ago without enough data. And now we have enough data. We have a tremendous amount of data that points to the fact that there is potential harm in some people. So the point I'm trying to make, and as you said before, we have to understand this is a nuanced situation, and simply saying that you should just trust the scientists is not the right thing to do. Because what are you supposed to do when scientists are disagreeing, which is what's happening right now? I'm not saying that I'm a scientist. I'm just saying that I'm looking at the data. I'm coming up with a different conclusion. Dr. Oliver, in her first sentence is, she's a scientist. That's why you should believe her. But you can't anymore. You have to look harder. And that's what I'm hoping to offer here, is how deeply you must look to actually dismantle the arguments coming from a scientist.
Yeah, just a last question maybe here to wrap things up is, do you think we had enough data from just looking at the data from the Pfizer trial to say that it may not have been a good idea for all age groups to be vaccinated? Do you think we, like, what I mean is at the beginning of the rollout of the campaigns for vaccines in what was it, early-ish 2021, spring 2021, did we have enough data from the Pfizer clinical trial as well as what we knew as infection fatality rates to give a more nuanced position at that time?
Absolutely. And, I'm going to summarize what you and I talked about in a piece of content that we put out a month ago called Making Sense of the COVID Vaccine, I think. And you're talking about the Pfizer trial. The Pfizer trial unequivocally showed that the risk of getting a vaccine was significantly higher than the risk prevention it offered in preventing COVID-19. That's what the trial data showed.
For all age groups or just some?
Well, they didn't break it down by age in that group, in the cohorts. So we can only say that, first of all, that was a relatively healthy group of volunteers. There was only 1 in 5 had some sort of comorbidity, and there were no people, I believe, over the age of 80, very few. And so we're looking at young, healthy people, and you saw that the risk of a serious adverse event was much greater than the risk of severe COVID that was prevented. So going on the raw data by themselves, it would be very questionable to get the vaccine. There was not enough data if you were sick or immunocompromised to make any determination. And the people were observed for less than 6 months. So we don't have any long-term safety data about the vaccine.
Yeah.
And we're not even going to talk about the potential malfeasance that was being brought up back in September of 2020 during the trials, where you have, clinical trial coordinators at Pfizer saying that the people were unblinded.
Yeah.
So there was enough there not to condemn everyone to a horrible COVID-19 death, but to say that this particular set of vaccines are falling short of what we would consider to be safe and effective. And we had that data back in the Pfizer trial. Yes.
Yeah, and given the Pfizer trial, we're looking at, primarily healthy participants, and anytime you take therapeutic like that and put it out into the real world, you're going to, expose to people who have perhaps who are less healthy. But in a sense, that also kind of suggests, well, hey, the Pfizer trial might have said if you're healthy, you're not really going to reduce many hospitalizations with vaccination. But maybe this vaccine, as we see in the real world data that we just looked at with the ONS data there, but it actually helped the unhealthy people maybe avoid severe outcome. But those unhealthy people were not representative of the trial per se. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yes, there were very few people who had multiple comorbidities in the vaccine trial, and that is the reason why we have to be very vigilant about looking at observational data, because we didn't have enough data from the Pfizer trial. So the kind of stuff that we talked about here with the ONS data is extremely important. That's how we should know, like, oh well, maybe we made a mistake about getting everyone vaccinated because it seems like it's not playing out nearly as well as we thought it would. That's why we have these studies. This is why we have the Office of National Statistics. This is also why we have databases from the CDC that are taken from state departments of health. We need to look at the mortality rates. We need to look at the deaths. We need to look at classification of deaths. All of these things were not done in a legitimate way in the beginning. We were just rushed to get people the vaccine, and it is not fair to just say anybody who thinks that there's a problem are grifters. I'm sorry. That's just, what is a grifter anyway, Joe? Do you know what a grifter is?
I don't know. I think it's someone who's, I don't know. I'm guessing here because I don't know the actual definition, but it sounds like it would be a pejorative to somebody who's just, you're just trying to like take advantage of the situation. And I don't know, like something like that. But
I don't think it's a compliment. I don't think it's a compliment.
No, it's definitely not. It's definitely not. So just to hit this home, because I think this is, the thing that people will always come back to, and this has already been answered. I'm going to just hit it again because I think it needs it. People are, they're going to say, well, this is what we know now, but we didn't know this when it mattered. We didn't know this at the beginning of the crisis. And I just want to hear it one more time. You're saying that at the end of the day, we knew that this should never have been so irresponsibly recommended to everyone because the data did not support that even back then, correct?
Correct.
All righty. Well, that's it. That's all. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing all of this. I think there's a lot, again, for people to think about here. And as always, you did a fantastic job laying it out.
Oh, thanks a lot, Joe. Thank you for bringing light to these issues, and hope to see you again soon.
Beauty.